time frame because because it tells you that although the topic is incredibly current in this moment, and unfortunately so after the events of that started on 24th of February this year, these dynamics are not new, in fact. And the research puzzle that we set out to analyze is this nexus between the foreign policy of Russia and illicit financial flows. So there is this widespread assumption that these two have, something to do with each other, but in academic research has not gone to the root yet to analyze exactly what this means conceptually, how we should, analyze it and map it, and what is the policy response that we should have for it. So we set out to look at this problem, to address complicated questions, including, is there a master plan and with what characteristics? What are major shifts in foreign policy actually accompanied by shifts in illicit financial flows? And really trying to analyze this complex juncture between the formal, the formality of Russian foreign policy, and this complex and informal world of IFF, illicit financial flows. So,
Tammy, can you just press the got it so that?
Oh, sure. I was hoping it was only us seeing it.
Yeah.
So everybody.
Yeah, and I'm the communications lead for the program, so you'll see.
So I will start by introducing our key argument and framework, and the main sort of framework of the findings, and then I'll pass on to Kat to discuss her work on sub-Saharan Africa, and to Tom first actually to work on Western Europe, and then I'll say some words on the Balkans. So the way that we approach this project is that we wanted to go basically to take an inductive approach, to go first to the empirics and to analyze how these instances, these dynamics work in 3 regions of the world. So Western Europe, the Western world, so including the US actually, Africa and Southeastern Europe, and then try to come up with a framework to disentangle it really. So our research question, as already mentioned, so what is, is there a nexus between the two? The answer is that definitely there is one, because Russian foreign policy encourages and facilitates illicit financial flows, but it is also vice versa. And I mean, this is something that I guess it's very apparent today, and Western governments have implicitly understood it by implementing sanctions against oligarchs and people close to the Kremlin. But it is a point that is worth making, because it didn't seem to be so crystal clear earlier on, and yet it is an important facet of Russian foreign policy. So our contribution pushes the boundaries of already existing studies, both in research, in academic research, and in more policy-facing type of studies. So there were these concepts of hybrid interference and sharp power going around. What we do is really take illicit financial flows at the center and see how they map onto these more widespread and complex dynamics. And one of our main conclusions is to warn against seeing these interactions as purely state-based, because one of the things that really emerges very strongly from our research is that what has been, sometimes construed as relations between states and even, geopolitical kind of conflicts is actually driven by networks of individuals and of actors, with also the slightly uncomfortable, conclusion within it that we shouldn't call ourselves out of these dynamics. So by situating illicit finance in the middle of our conceptualization, we first had to deal with some difficult issues, which is how do we actually conceptualize illicit financial flows? There is a lot of discussion on this point, and the main problem is that illicit is very often still conflated with illegal. But sometimes what is illicit is not necessarily legal, and sometimes what is illegal can be legalized in countries where the rule of law is not the norm. So, for instance, by controlling the judiciary, you're able to basically give the stamp of approval on dynamics and on instances that we would in our countries term as grand corruption. The same way, this will resonate with a lot of people coming from transitional countries, when seeking relationships between people close to the state, close to the regime, basically allow for people to get to, through privatization processes that are not transparent, get to a lot of wealth in that sense, and get to control over companies, as well as tenders, like in the case of Hungary, as we'll hear later on, etc. So our, first kind of argument in terms of pushing the conceptual boundaries is that when looking at these dynamics, when looking at how IFF works in terms of its relationship to foreign policy, we should really think about illicit finance as a concept that is not only put in the realm of legality because of these issues, because sometimes it can become legalized in the countries of origin, and therefore we have this issue that we're not able to link it to the predicate crime. The way we have worked, we've been able then to map the instances of interference in three subsets, which we have termed political interference, media and narrative framing, and finally violence. So what you can see on the screen are a number of practices that we have identified, and it will become clearer as we present our case studies. One thing that I would highlight is that one trend that we saw is that Russia ups the ante. So in many cases, they start with a more softer approach. So by using corruption, manipulating energy and other commodities, they try to exert political influence. They try to exert influence on elections, frame the narrative, and then if it doesn't work, sort of goes for the more violent options. So it's sort of also a bit of an escalatory tendency that we see here. I will now pass on the word to my colleague Tom May, who will tell us a bit more about the role of the West in these dynamics, also introducing some snippets from our research in the anti-corruption evidencing project that Ambika has introduced earlier on. Tom, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Good. I can see myself now. It was a little bit strange before because I couldn't see myself, but all good. So yeah, thanks, Tenna. Now, my background to this project is another Global Integrity funded report that was released by Chatham House at the end of last year. The UK's kleptocracy problem that really focuses on the huge amount of money from Russia and other kleptocracies that has flooded into the UK over the last 2 decades, and how ill-equipped we are to deal with it, both from an enforcement point of view, very poor enforcement of anti-money laundering legislation in the UK, but generally the legislation itself isn't really equipped to deal with kleptocracies. And to analyze and highlight some of the problems, we focused on real estate, and we came up with a database of around 100 properties owned in the UK by politically exposed people from Russia and Central Asia. If you could have the next slide, please. And we found, as I say, huge amounts of money flowing into the property market. I think the Russia here is the highest of the 6 countries. I think that's definitely definitely an undersell. We have many more properties from Russia that we just couldn't verify in the time we had, and since obviously the Russian sanctions, we're learning a lot more about just the incredible amount of wealth that has been placed into London. And my colleague John Heathershaw came up with a rather novel way of demonstrating how the legislation isn't working. If you go to the next slide, please, Dana. or Veronica, I'm not sure who's on the tab today. My colleague John explains this a bit better than I do, but I'll have a go. Basically, what we hope by introducing new legislation, such as recently the Unexplained Wealth Order in the UK, is that we hope that this legislation will have an effect on the outside, the kleptocracies, that the wrongdoers will be sanctioned, and that they will lose power, and the good people will rise to the top. But actually, what we found was the opposite, in that the insiders, the political incumbents, very rarely lose property, very rarely are targeted by our enforcement authorities, and they retain their property. And it's only when they lose power in their home countries that they fall out of favor, that they have a possibility of losing the property in the UK. And that is because the insiders can use Western enablers to, in quotes, legitimize, legalize their assets and bring them to the UK, Europe, and the West. If we go on to the next slide, please. And I think this is the actual key takeaway from our research, and it's something that Tenna has alluded to, is that this project is called Serious and Organized Crime. But if we go in with that mindset, we perhaps miss the point that this legitimized, legalized capital flowing from Russia, which might not actually be illegal, it might not be money laundering because it has been legalized in Russia, is where the problems lie. The oligarchs, as we know, create this obshak, this treasure that can be used for a variety of purposes. And in our research for this project, we highlight Yevgeny Prigozhin, often dubbed Putin's chef. Now, he didn't earn his money illegally. He was handed government contracts to supply meals to the military and to schools. He's then taken those billions that he's earned, and he has financed the paramilitary organization Wagner, allegedly, that Kat will talk about in a moment. And he was also behind the massive disinformation campaigns, the troll farms that possibly had an influence on the election in the United States in 2016. So by just focusing on illegal funds, we're missing, I think, the point here. And as I say, the legislation around this is really lacking, and we need to, I think, concentrate our efforts into finding a way that not just freezing this kind of money, but actually seizing it. We've got sanctions in place at the moment on various Russian oligarchs, which is great. But there is a danger that when the war ends, hopefully soon, Russia withdraws, whatever the end of the war looks like, do we just then release these assets, unfreeze these assets, in order for them to be used in a future conflict or future disinformation campaign, a future political campaign in Russia? And some of the findings you have on the screen are some of the difficulties we're facing. That the anti-money laundering legislation does not really set up to tackle the problem of kleptocracies. Certainly in the UK, and I think elsewhere as well. I'll hand on now to Kat to talk about Africa.
Okay, hi everybody. I hope you can all hear me okay.
Yes, so great.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks so much for having us here today. And yeah, thank you to colleagues in the Open Gov Hub and also Global Integrity. I'm going to talk about my case study primarily, which was on sub-Saharan Africa. I'd like to say, I suppose, a small caveat, which is this project was the first time I really focused on sub-Saharan Africa as a region. My prior background is in Eurasia. But as I was researching and sort of doing background reading around the project at the beginning, I somehow sort of realized that we can't really understand the complexities of Russian illicit financial flows without looking at Africa. Any case study, I think, or any project that looks at global Russian illicit financial flows really needs to have a section on Africa in it. So I rose to the challenge, I hope, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I was looking at. So really, primarily, I'd like to say that this is, I suppose, a call really for scholars, for policymakers, for researchers to pay more attention to the Russia-Africa relationship. I would say it's probably by far the most far-reaching in terms of Russian illicit financial flows, and also the most brazen. Of course, we hear a lot about Russian private military contractors, such as the Wagner Group, as Tom said, operating in African continents, particularly Mali. Of course, we've heard a lot about recently, but this is not really so much coming alongside the important question of how they're being used to guard and bolster Russian investments in Africa. So I think what's really interesting about the Russia-Africa relationship is that you have these sort of formal and informal dimensions. Of course, Russia's stated aim is to create a so-called independent center of power on the African continent. And it has done this then through a variety of mechanisms, including, of course, the sort of most formal, sort of high-level cooperation, which is the Russia-Africa Summit, held for the first time in Sochi in 2019. There's the second summit is scheduled to take place this year in Addis Ababa in November. But then also you have things like think tanks such as Afrique, which was sanctioned by the US government last year, which sort of also help kind of construct a sort of pro-Russian narrative inside Africa. Of course, the prolific use of fake Facebook profiles in various African countries, trying to again shape the narrative towards Russia.
C'est mieux d'aller avec la voiture parce qu'ils disent il va pleuvoir.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not sure if anyone was trying to say something there, but I'll just continue. Yeah, you also see, of course, political advisors being employed, Russian political advisors supporting pro-Russian political candidates in various local elections, not to mention, of course, private military contractors, as I say, doing crowd control, but also during protests, but also providing security for Russian natural resource extraction projects. Of course, these dynamics can be seen in a wide variety of African countries, including the Central African Republic, Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, Burkina Faso, and elsewhere. We've got a case study of Sudan here on the slide. I only looked at 2 case studies in this particular project. Of course, the project could be expanded and deepened, and I certainly hope it will be in the future. But yeah, you can sort of see here on the slide how we sort of used our tripartite framework that Tiana explained to really explore the different ways in which Russian malign activities create space for Russian illicit finance. So you can see here in the case of Sudan, in fact, the Russian elites have forged close personal ties, both with the Bashir government that was deposed in a coup in 2019, and then subsequently with the sort of military tandem that now rule the country, including Mohammed Hemeti, who is one of the country's main gold magnates. And of course, these ties are then used to facilitate the transfer of gold from Sudan to Russia. And of course, then you have these various private military corporations, which are particularly the Wagner Group, which are used then to protect Russian mining endeavors in Sudan. So I think it's really interesting to sort of see how these three dimensions converge, particularly in Sudan, but also elsewhere in Africa. Just earlier this year, the Telegraph reported, a British newspaper reported that Russian agents have in fact been smuggling Sudanese gold to Russia for years, thanks to the long-standing personal ties. And of course, these sort of illicitly obtained gold reserves can now be used to cushion the impact of Western sanctions on the Russian economy. Let's also not forget, of course, that Sudan has also been sanctioned by the US as well. So they are almost sort of pushed, I suppose, in to the arms of one another. If I could have the next slide, please. So I'm just going to draw some quick conclusions now. I've got 3 conclusions here. I think what we can really see is the real importance of understanding this kind of emerging model of illicit finance, or sort of the Kremlin's model of illicit finance in Africa, which basically it deploys informal political and sometimes military means in order to secure lucrative natural resource extraction contracts. And as I said at the beginning, the African cases really constitute, I think, some of the most extreme or maybe brazen examples of the way in which this model of IFF is deployed very profitably. And another aspect I think that's really important as well is that many African states are not necessarily pro-Russian per se, but they're certainly anti-Western, which is something that Russian agents have exploited to their benefit. This is really exemplified, I guess, in the UN General Assembly's resolution on the 2nd of March, which demanded an end to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in which 25 African states, many of which have substantial Russian investments, they either abstained or they didn't vote. So this is something that I think we really need to take into account when understanding, I suppose, the geopolitical shifts on the African continent. And then just finally, one of, I think, perhaps the longer term trends, perhaps the more worrying trends, is that Western sanctions may in fact lead to more illicit financial flows between Russia and Africa, not less. So yeah, from the perspective of Russia, these ties with mineral-rich African states, in not only Sudan, but also several of the others that I've mentioned, they may enable Moscow to minimize the impact of sanctions. And so in the short term, we may see sort of relatively low levels of financial cooperation, but certainly over the medium and longer term, I think we can expect more illicit financial flows between Russia and the African continent. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I have worked so closely with Tom and Tenna. This is the first time I'm actually hearing you. And so I just like turned over to Tenna and I was like, Catherine's great. She's like, yeah, she is. Yes, yeah, I knew that. Oh, sorry.
So just briefly following on to what Tom and Kat presented, my case study focused on Southeastern Europe. And it is a less brazen case study than Africa, following what Kat just said now, but not less interesting. And I think that first of all, we need to put this into perspective. I mean, often, perceptions can be slightly deceptive. We are used to thinking in the West that Russia and countries in the Balkans have very strong historical ties, especially with Serbia, for instance. There's a strong, brotherly love, Bratya Slaviane, and that's always been the case. But actually, this is not quite true. The Soviet Union and the former Yugoslavia were aligned only for 3 years after the Second World War, from 45 to 48. And afterwards, there was a Tito-Stalin split. So for a very long time, in fact, these two, blocs were actually not aligned at all, quite on the contrary. And I mean, this is interesting because then it also makes us understand that some of these dynamics were created relatively recently, in the last couple of decades. And also the importance, which is something that I always bang on, about the local actors in using this, Russia for their own ends, be them to get economic benefit out of it, be to use, the narrative coming from Russia to project a scare of Russia coming to the Balkans, and basically present themselves as the stable leaders that are able to guarantee the stability and security of their countries vis-a-vis the West. So the two countries that I picked in Southeastern Europe that are able to respond to this research question are Montenegro and Serbia. Why? Because there was a very clear moment in 2014 when there was a different path taken by these two countries in their relations with Russia. Meaning that Montenegro decided to really all of a sudden almost completely turn upside down the relationship with Russia by implementing sanctions that the West and the European Union had levied against Russia because of the invasion in Crimea, whereas Serbia did not. So my question was, did this make a difference for their illicit financial flows or not? I will not go into depth in the case studies. You can to leave more time for other comments and questions and discussion later on. But I invite you to have a look at the papers, if you wish, in which basically I try to trace the recent history in terms of economic relations, in terms of FDI, and also showing how much of this FDI in fact was very questionable, meaning that for a very long, for a relatively long period in the 2000s, Montenegro and Russia were very, very closely aligned, and indeed, actually, Russia. There is, a fair argument to say that Russia funded Montenegro's referendum of independence against Serbia. So again, this sort of makes us question our preconceptions. Are Serbia and Russia such good allies? Why? Illicit financial flows again is part of the reason why, because it was, useful and good for Russia from its foreign policy perspective to have a friendly nation on the Mediterranean, and at the same time, these foreign policy, ties were accompanied by a large influx of Russian money into the coast, into tourism in Montenegro and real estate, in a moment in which privatization was going bonkers in Montenegro, because especially after 2006, after independence, there was a big push for privatization that was heavily geared towards rent-seeking practices, towards granting these contracts and these deals to people who are close to the regime. And then after this foreign policy shift in 2014, indeed we see a difference. Indeed we see in the short run FDI going down from Russia to Montenegro. Oleg Deripaska, who is a famously very pro-Kremlin oligarch, who was directed, let's say, by the Kremlin to buy an important asset in Montenegro, also to kind of reinforce the state coffers of Montenegro ahead of the independence referendum. After 2014, there is completely lost law. He then sues the country. But at the end, we can see now that FDI is again going up. So what we can conclude is that yes, there was a shift in the relations that was accompanied also by a lower inflow of IFF from kind of Kremlin-connected individuals. But at the same time, this inertia and these kind of pragmatic relations have continued in the background. Serbia, on the other hand, continued absolutely imperturbed, completely undisturbed. Their rent-seeking practices that were set up with Russia, I would argue, very, very heavily and very importantly at the beginning of the 1990s. So, when, especially with Serbia being isolated by the West, and again, it's probably a timely thing to remind once again that sanctions have, have positive effects for what we want them to do, but can also have some negative effects. In the case of Serbia, they turned towards Russia in the 1990s, and there were those gas intermediary schemes set up back then that are still in place today. And even a change in government in Serbia, like after the Milosevic's fall in 2000, even when they tried to crack down on it, it lasted for a few years. And then these rent-seeking practices that were set up in the 1990s were so strong that they rebounded, and it's something that we have still today. In general, the penetration in the energy sector in Serbia by Russia is almost complete, and it's of course a massive problem now. And really, this issue of the local proxies and of the partners of Russia and Serbia is very important. Most cogently, the Socialist Party of Serbia, which is Milosevic's local party, still very close to the ruling party in Serbia and part of the government. Most often than not, we still don't know because the government is still up in the air in Serbia, not being formed. But they were, this continuity element that kept these relationships going throughout this time. So skip the takeaways, and I'll go straight to the policy recommendations of our whole project. So we do believe, on the basis of what we researched, that it is very important to put the focus on local anti-corruption efforts that are able to deal with these issues in the long run. Why? Because ultimately, Russian illicit financial flows and this activity that you can definitely very malign in many instances by Russia, it rests upon homegrown ills. It rests upon patronage networks, rent-seeking structures, use, local politicians of this narrative to confuse their partners in the West. So in that sense, anti-corruption efforts to be effective, they need to be locally led. And this is really the best bet we can have for the future to contrast these dynamics. Then stimulate constructive capital as opposed to corrosive capital, which is a term popularized by SIPE, an organization here in DC. That means exploiting rule of law weaknesses and making them wider through influx of money. So we are able, our governments in the West are able to contrast that by offering an alternative with different types of investment. Then practice what you preach. In terms of what Tom said, I hope it's unfortunately clear to all of us by now that we have not been, confronting this issue head on for a very long time. So we need to cut the West's enabling role to really have good effects in the long run, and provide alternatives to Russian foreign policy engagement. So, for instance, in the Balkans, there is this absolute disillusionment that the EU perspective is real. Yeah, so the EU and the West needs to practice what they preach in that respect as well. They need to give rewards when countries actually deliver to be able to keep them anchored to them. In sub-Saharan Africa, Catherine argues we need to strengthen and come up with new for engagement. And ultimately, and finally, to sum up, we need to really take the long-term view. I mean, we know that these issues are a problem. And it's not only about Russia. You saw how many other authoritarian countries are laundering their money and laundering their reputations in the West, and ultimately also strengthening their authoritarian regimes at home. So now we've been really warned. Let's not come again in a situation in which we're scrambling to have a policy action after such a dramatic and terrible event as a war. Let's take a long-term view and tackle these problems with Russia and with other countries ahead of time to be able to have the right effects. Thank you so much, and sorry for taking too much time.
So I'm going to very quickly introduce IFFs, who I'm very excited is a Hungarian journalist, or a journalist from Hungary, depending on how you do it. And so the last two presenters don't have decks, so I would say if you could just make sure you enunciate as much as possible, because a lot of people are, about 25 people remote as well. So and all the mics are there, so.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I'm not an expert in Russia, so I just wanted to clarify that I'm a journalist, and what I'm talking is Hungary's relations to Russia. I will shortly introduce the context and then talk about the business ties, the political, this is all collide, and the intelligence activity, Russian intelligence activity in Hungary, and then later a bit on the war currently going on in Ukraine. So the Hungarian Prime Minister is Viktor Orbán, and since 2010 he became a very strong leader of the country, and he is consolidating his power, basically meaning that he decides everything that is important and less important in the country's life. So if something Hungary does as an actor in a foreign policy, it was decided by Orbán, of course. But he himself, in the late 80s, made fame when he started his political career. He was a liberal, anti-communist, anti-Soviet, anti-Russian politician. And he done a lot to help Hungary to join NATO and European Union. And he was also an anti-Russian prime minister when in 1998 and 2002. And when the socialist government started to rebuild the Russian relations after 2004, he rashly criticized this. And he really condemned, for example, Russia's aggression in Georgia 2008, which is not happened before this year. So before the elections 2010, it was very clear that Orbán and his party will be the winner of the elections. And half a year before the elections. He was invited to St. Petersburg by Putin just to politicians get to know each other. And we don't know what happened in St. Petersburg that day, but we know that when Orban returned, he became very friendly towards Putin's Russia. Maybe he just they made friends and he saw the business opportunity with Russia, and that he can use that if he's got a strong relation with Russia, he can counterbalance the dependence on the European Union. So he can say to the European Union that I'm not only a member of the European Union, but I have also partners in the East. And also he believes that the Western societies, the Western countries are in decline, and the future is in the East, not only in Russia, but also coming from China. And also that I'm sure you're aware how he thinks about democracy and what kind of system he built on. It's more, many say that it's an authoritarian regime and not a democracy anymore. And you know that if you would like to build a system such that you need tools, you have to control the economy, the media, the juridical system, and you have to build it the same way that they did in Russia. They have the tools, so they share practices, for example, so it's good to have relation with similar-minded politicians. And there are also like theories that I don't want to comment on that, but I'd like to say because in the media it comes up, and also the level of gossip, people claim to have knowledge on it, that he might be blackmailed, with the compromise, and in Moscow might be something on him, but of course we don't know that. So by now, even the Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs is very he's sharing Orban's idea of being friends, having friends in the East. But it's also well known that Orban is bored in the Hungarian politics because he thinks he won so many times, he is the best, and he wants to be an international player. And having strong friends, it's, of course, strong friends. So, yes, so by today, critics say that Hungary is a strong ally of Russia and the European Union, and most recently you could see that Hungary hindered sanctions on Russia. For example, this ban on oil, it was delayed by at least 3 weeks because of Hungary, and also Hungary took down Patriarch Kirill from the sanctions list, and who is a very important man in Moscow. So regarding the business, there are few very well-known and big businesses that were beneficial mostly to Russia. After 2010, I will give some examples, but the very first one that there is a Hungarian oil company, MOL, and Russia company had like 20% of that, but Hungary could buy it back, and it was very important to Orban to consolidate his power in Hungary against a strong businessman in Hungary. So it was a favor from Russia, helping Orban to consolidate his power in Hungary. And I'll give you like 2 or 3 other examples. For example, there was a gas trading company, that called, and all of a sudden, new stakeholders appeared in this company, some offshore companies, businessmen close to Orban, and some Russian people. And after the structure change in this company, the government made certain decisions that made this company very lucrative. Basically, within a few years, they made a profit of 200 million euros without any risk, without any investment, without any costs. And it was purely made by government decisions and an approval of Russia, because it was about importing gas from the West. One of the other is that Hungary wanted to build a new nuclear plant in Hungary, and the government started to talks with Western and South Korean and Japanese energy companies about building this one. And after Orbán's met with the head of Rosatom, they suddenly, without any tender, gave the business to Russia, which means that it was also financed by a loan from Russia. We're talking about 10 billions of euros. And this was a political gesture to Russians, and also strengthened the dependence on Russian energy, because Hungary's oil consumption is 65% is Russian oil, and the gas is 80%. And of course, if you build a Russian nuclear plant, you have to buy the uranium from Russia because it's not compatible. As Hungary's energy depends on Russia. I have some other detailed examples, but I will skip them because we are short on time. If I'm right, I will jump to the political level and secret services. So, for example, Hungary blocked the NATO-Ukraine negotiations for years, and this, if it wouldn't happen, Ukraine is much more protected now. So how serious blocking those negotiations were 5 years ago, and 3 years ago, a few years ago, it became evident now with the war. And of course, the political level, that after 2009 until the pandemic, Orbán and Putin they met every year at least once in Budapest, once in Moscow, and once maybe somewhere else, but they have this yearly meeting. And also after the pandemic, Orbán was one of the last foreign politicians in Moscow before the war. He was there in the 1st of February.
About 7 minutes left, and I still want to give Matthew a chance and hopefully take at least 2 questions.
Yeah, I'm just sorry. Okay.
There's enough people in the room that you guys will be talking for a while, but I don't think we can extend it for people online. So do you want to just do one last statement?
Yeah, one last. Hungarian secret Russian intelligence is so embedded in Hungary that NATO allies are not sharing, and other Western secret services not sharing information with Hungary, because there is a tremendous concern that Russia is basically in Hungary, and Hungarian government shares sensitive information with Russia.
Okay, I'm sure that, yeah, I mean, most people here are here in person, so
yeah,
we can hear a lot more. Just wanted to hand it off to Matthew, who's going to finish us off. He's the founder and CEO of MindTrend, which is an education startup that uses AI and neural networks.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, actually, and I just really wanted to thank Tina and her team, Tena and her team, Catherine and Thomas. I really encourage everyone, if you have an opportunity to look at the deeper research that they've done, it's quite comprehensive. It's across a number of different fields. I know you're really topically presenting some of that today, Tena, and it was just a privilege to be able to go through that. So one of the things that I noticed, I'm in technology. We work in particular in the space of credibility. A lot of people refer to things as fake news, or they talk about bot networks and things like that, kind of influencing. But in the broader context about credibility, and I think the question that I often face is what's behind the veneer. Thomas brought up something really interesting about the use of real estate. Real estate is commonly a great way to either to launder money, or otherwise, if we think about a credit report of some sort, if you get a mortgage, it establishes some veracity of your legitimacy to make payments, be a citizen, or be a contributing part of society. You're not. When we think about organized crime, when we think about something that's illicit, we're normally thinking about somebody seedy. And also state actors, somebody thinks that this is super recognizable, but really I think the broader problem, particularly in technology, is that you're dealing with a lot of sympathizers. they're not so cut and dry. I mean, people are not this black and white thing. It's not just, I'm all about what Putin's doing, or I'm all about what Biden's doing, or Trump, or any of these other influential sort of role players in the political spectrum. But I really want to touch on sort of how that's playing in the technology space longer term, because we're starting to see some things in the Ukrainian environment, and it's easy to look back. We can look at sort of the Bosnian, Yugoslavian situation. We can see what happened, war crimes after the World War, World War II. But all this stuff is looking in arrears, and I want to take a moment to look a little bit forward, which is, we can see that there's grain stoppages in Ukraine. This is, we talk about it like near term, okay, this is going to be some sort of famine issue. But really, there's a lot of theft that's going on. War is a great cover for theft. And the question is, what happens longer term? And Tana brings up this term, reputation laundering. And technology is starting to really move into a space where we've seen it in elections. People talk about bot farms, for example, or we run into bots on Twitter or Facebook and these sorts of things, some of them easily recognizable. But the whole purpose of those networks is to establish some sort of legitimacy. And it's very superficial. It's not too different than when people were issuing loans in the mortgage crisis, where there was really no underlying basis for why that loan should be issued, but there was a general laziness that was occurring within the space of establishing that these are credible participants in that environment. So I think a lot of what we're seeing on the technology space is that these are mechanisms by which people hide what happened or where it came from. We've got new inventions that are touted as the new currencies, the world of digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, and so forth. But these are actually really excellent for being able to move finance in a way that isn't traceable, doesn't go through the same banking apparatus, and that enable some of the behaviors that we're talking about. So I think that there's a deeper level of caring about, I think, the integrity of what it means for your organization to source finance from a particular location. We see it surface a little bit in the news. Again, I want to say, like, the idea that everyone's saying fake news this, fake news that. There's you don't need a lot of fake news. You need to have some basis which people are going to adhere to, something that appeals to their belief systems, and then they kind of latch on to the other things that are attached to it. But this is no different than you thinking, hey, this person's really popular because they have a whole bunch of followers on LinkedIn. Well, maybe they're a part of a bunch of bots that are adding that clout. And so now you've got a lot of attention being pointed at this space. And I think what we need to be cautious of is, as we're looking forward, what is the regulatory environment for especially digital currencies that allow money to move across borders? We're talking about the encouragement of that happening as a result of sanctions. So now you don't just have smaller organizations or let's call them NGOs of some sort, but you have actually a large country. Russia is massive in terms of its influence, where as you start to target these individuals that have quite a bit of clout, they need the money flows in order to maintain influence. You can't do large scale influence without some of that. So I really think that a lot of it comes back to us looking at especially anybody in a position of responsibility, not being lazy about determining the integrity of what the end relationships are in your organization. Where did that money actually come from? Who was the person behind that? Deeper than, did you pull a credit report? What's the actual baseline that establishes this person should be a participant in your society? This person's not going to be having some sort of subterfuge in the space. And I think the difficulty is, we're talking about corruption, is we're always thinking about in arrears. Well, of course, nobody's like arriving at, yeah, I'm corrupt and I want to do this thing. And even the person who's there, the dependents, I think Akos said this very nicely, dependency is a big issue. Once the dependency is there, the influence is much stronger. The difficulty of being able to withdraw sort of your, I would say, tacit approval for what's occurring, or thinking like, it's not a big deal, it's this one thing. And if it surfaces in the news, if journalism finds out about it, And then it's like, oh, we discovered the truth, right? So this is the opposite of fake news. We really discovered what was going on here. In that layer, it was actually like pretty smoothed over. Dependencies are really high. That person gets ousted. You know, Tana mentions this with relation to somebody falls out. Of course, the real estate's lost, their position, their influence is gone. And it's treated as though it was this just surgical removal. But the thing is much larger. The aspect of how we are as human beings, you know, sort of who we trust, and to an extent, just a native natural laziness to once we trusted something, once we have a conclusion that we trust something, we don't really go back and vet it. We don't really talk so much about transparency, or we let it go at a certain point. We're like, it's enough. I think that in the technological space, we really need to move towards what does it really look like for us to be able to, especially for large transaction flows, establish where's that money coming from, what's the background behind it, and how can we use that to facilitate encouraging, you know, a stronger growth? We talked about more positive investments. What does that look like to have that counteracted? Because where the money is coming from is establishing a lot of the direction and attention of people. And in particular, when we deal with technology tends to be a pricey endeavor. Running advertisements on Facebook or Google, these are expensive enterprises, but they are in the same, you know, sort of a technological space of rewriting the history a bit, you know, giving you, if you come in and you were somebody that historically had a really bad reputation in your home country, you don't necessarily need to make up fake stuff. You just need to do a lot of stuff that seems more prominent, more newsworthy, more interesting. Make a donation to something, show up at some prominent event and have everyone laud your influence in your social circle. So I think like a lot of it is the legwork of establishing a culture, regardless of the nation that you're a part of, that really makes credibility a real topic, and that credibility being more than superficial, and with the idea that the corruption that's going to be happening, that we're going to be facing, that our kids are going to be facing, is not the corruption of whatever we saw in arrears. It's got a new space, and that sort of regular awareness and cognizance is, I think, super important.
Awesome, thanks. So what I'm going to do is sort of officially close out the online portion, just to be respectful, and I think that there's already, most people have probably left because it's past 10 already. But I just wanted to thank Tom and Catherine and Veronica for, she's the one I've been texting this whole time. So I really appreciate that all going so smoothly. And then let's moderate a discussion in person here. Are you guys comfortable with that since you're here? So let's do that. So I'm gonna give everybody like a 2-minute break. Just if you want to grab a coffee, which is up to you. So it's very selfish. And then we'll be back in 2 minutes and we'll start the session here.